All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started here for the last panel, and thank you all for having been here throughout the day. I think this has been a great success for what we're calling the first annual Ideas Conference, because we're going to continue to build on this. We're going to do this every year. This is going to be a great thing for Pinellas County, for the city of Seminole, for St. Pete College. The last panel, and this is really going to be a great one, is on transportation, the future of transportation, transportation technology. We've got a great panel here today, and the one thing, as I've tried to provide context for each one of these topics that we've talked about, listen, I think we all went through the ballot initiative locally on Greenlight. We also know the future of technology, how that is going to continue to change transportation. I will tell you the one thing to keep in mind in terms of the policy discussions we're going to have, often what it comes down to is how to pay for it. Whether and how to pay for it, because I think there's consensus throughout the country, throughout the community on improving transportation. The question is always, how do we pay for it, and how do we best use each marginal dollar for the next transportation investment? That certainly underlines the federal policy we'll talk about a little bit today when it comes to the gas tax, how we pay for federal highways, and so forth. But let me introduce the panel that we have here today. First, State Senator Jeff Brandes. Many of you know Senator Jeff Brandes. He was first elected to the Florida House of Representatives in 2010, elected to the Florida Senate in 2012, re-elected in 2014, and he is currently the chairman of the Senate Committee on Transportation. Please welcome our Senator, Senator Jeff Brandes. And then we're pleased to have Florida Transportation Secretary Jim Boxhold, named Secretary of the Florida Department of Transportation by Governor Scott in January of this year, overseeing the investment of $10 billion this year in Florida transportation spending. Secretary Boxhold started his career in Washington, D.C., working for U.S. Representative Porter Goss, ultimately serving as the Congressman's legislative director. Boxhold holds a B.A. in political science from the George Washington University. Please welcome Secretary Boxhold. And then we have Dr. Stephen Poulsen, the Director of Mobility Policy Research at the Center for Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida in Tampa. He served as on the Board of Directors of the Hillsborough Area Regional Transit Authority for 13 years, and on the Board of Directors of the Hillsborough County Metropolitan Planning Organization for 7 years. Dr. Poulsen recently co-authored Commuting in America 2013, the American Association of Highway and Transportation Officials Definitive Resource on Commuting. Please welcome Dr. Poulsen. And finally, our very own Commissioner Ken Welch. Commissioner Ken Welch was elected to the Pinellas County Commission in 2000. He's a former chairman of the Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority and serves as chairman of the Pinellas Metropolitan Planning Organization. Commissioner Welch holds a BA degree in accounting from the University of South Florida and a master's degree in business administration from Florida A&M University. Please welcome our County Commissioner Ken Welch. With that, we normally have an order I'm supposed to go to. I don't have that on here, so let's start with Senator Brandes for opening comments, and we'll go down the line.
Well, first of all, thank you, Congressman, for hosting us again today. Exciting times in transportation. I think you've seen technology disrupt many spaces, but we're beginning to see technology disrupt transportation, and I think it will continue to disrupt in that space for many, many years to come. 4 years ago, there was no such thing as Uber. Today there is. There was no such thing as Lyft. Today there is. We weren't talking about trucks platooning, which means when they drive very close together in order to achieve better gas mileage. Today we are. And our systems and our state are going to have to adjust to that. And I think what's so exciting about the state of Florida is we've really been a leader, and we're really thought of as a leader, not only because our policies, but because we're such a large state. People really look to Florida for leadership, and we're blessed to have one of the best Department of Transportations in the nation. 2011, we were the second state behind Nevada to begin to discuss the concept of cars that drove themselves. You heard a little bit about that last panel. And we worked with Google and we worked with the major auto manufacturers to define the term, to look at this technology and to say, where is it and where is it going? And so in 2011, I took this clandestinely put together Toyota Prius on I-10 at 70 miles an hour for 10 miles, and that car drove itself while I was in the driver's seat, but my hands were off the wheel, my feet were off the pedals, and for 10 miles that car drove itself in 2011. Fast forward to 2014, I'm in an Audi A7 on the Leroy Selman Expressway, and it doesn't look clandestinely put together. There isn't parts bolted onto the outside of this vehicle. It looks like an Audi A7, and the interior looks like a brand new car. And there's a little button on the driver and on the steering wheel that you press, and it says autopilot engaged, and the car drove itself on the Leroy Selman. And it's amazing, and it's coming, and it's going to transform not only the way we drive, not only the way we think about transportation, but our downtowns as well. Because when you think about our shopping malls, which were designed for parking for the day after Thanksgiving, but when we can cut those spaces by a third, or when our downtowns don't need so many parking spaces because the cars simply stay in the grid and go pick up new people, I think it's going to revolutionize so much. And so I think it's exciting to talk a little bit about and think about the future at a New Ideas Conference, because I think if there's any space that's got new ideas in place, it's in transportation. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Brandes. Secretary Boxell.
Thank you, Congressman, and I think you touched on the issues that are leading the way in transportation. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Obviously there is a funding crisis in Washington. The state of Florida has a record transportation budget this year because the legislature and the governor have sort of diversified the revenue sources going into the trust fund. So that's given us an opportunity to get past that very basic question of how we fund these projects and start looking at ways that we can be creative in our financing and use the financing to deliver projects faster. And so if you look down the road in Orlando on the I-4 Ultimate project, essentially what we've done there is through a public-private partnership, or a P3, we've leveraged the resources of the private sector to combine 20 or 30 what we would consider individual projects into one mega project. And the beauty of that is that it allows us to deliver a project in 6 years that if we went through our standard bidding process would take 20 or 25, which is great from the DOT perspective, but it's even better from the driving public's perspective, because as difficult as the I-4 reconstruction will be over a 6-year period, imagine if we had done it over a 20 or 25-year period. And so to me, the opportunity to talk about financing and ways to finance these projects is an exciting one. I think both the Congressman and the Chairman have talked about the importance of technology in the transportation space. The cars obviously are outpacing our ability to design roads. Several years ago when we started talking about autonomous vehicles, at DOT we focused on, well, how do we design and engineer our roads to take advantage of it? And the simple reality is the manufacturers and the folks in that sphere are way ahead of us. And there are semi-autonomous vehicles out on the road today, and it won't be very long until there are fully autonomous roads out on the cars out on the road today. We do have an opportunity. We have a lot of IT infrastructure in our roads, a lot of sensors, and so we have an opportunity to look at what we call connected vehicles, so that you take these vehicles and you connect them to the information infrastructure that we already use in our traffic management centers, so that they can do what we do for drivers on an individual basis. And so that democratization of traffic information really will make a difference. And then finally, I think particularly in Florida, we're a year-round state. We have people, particularly here down in St. Pete, that walk and bike and jog year-round. We have an unfortunate reputation as it relates to bicycle and pedestrian safety. And so we need to think about transportation differently, think about not only protecting vulnerable road users, but making the roads available for everyone, for all the different users. And so the department has adopted a complete streets policy, which means that we treat all users the same. We make sure that whether you're in a car or you're walking, that you have a safe and enjoyable experience. And so to me, that's another emerging, critically important issue in the state, is how do we balance the need of all of our road users. And so with that, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Secretary Boxell. Dr. Poulsen.
Thank you. I also very much appreciate the opportunity to be here. As an avocation, I spend my time looking at innovation and creative ideas and doing research to focus on transportation. So it's a pleasure to be part of a panel. Myself and my colleagues at Qatar, we've got 40 faculty that's our full-time occupation doing that. Transportation has always been, one of the most critical elements of the economy and society. The average person spends about 80 minutes a day traveling. About 17% of household budget goes to transportation, the second highest, leading cause of fatalities for many age cohorts, important to the economy, to society, to communication, social relationships, commerce, obviously tourism in Florida. And so it is a huge, important aspect of the economy, and one that frankly needs all the help and innovation it can get, because it's important to continue to improve it and to continue to make it function. It has suffered from inadequate funding in some places in the country, and innovation can help bridge that. And the innovation isn't just technology. We've acknowledged some of the innovation in autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles, as well as app-based transportation systems, and those will all help. But there's also innovation in processes and partnerships and governance that are going to help improve transportation. We've recognized how important it is, and that means we're much more holistic when we think about transportation than was historically the case. But because of that, it makes it admittedly very, very complex, with loads of stakeholders and loads of interests that need to be integrated into solutions. So it's a perpetually challenging and exciting area to be involved in, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Fulton. Commissioner Welch.
Thank you, Congressman Jolly. After the Senator, the Secretary, and the Doctor, most of the points have been hit on. So let me just first thank you and thank SPC's Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions for really a whole day of important conversations to move our community and our nation forward. I agree with what's been said so far. I would emphasize the importance of public transportation, and from a local elected official's perspective, what has amazed me is the linkage between transportation and so many other important community issues that we're trying to move forward, from economic development and job access to homelessness and poverty reduction, and even our tourism economy. The common thread in all those is transportation is an important element. And we are doing, I think, a very good job, particularly in Pinellas County and the Tampa Bay area, in building up our roads and our road capacity. We've got some very important projects underway, from US 19 to the Bayside Bridge, which is complete, Ulmerton Road, CR 296, and the Bryan Dairy Road project, which will connect to the Gateway Express. So and some folks would say some of those roads are perpetually under construction, like US 19. But we are making progress, and you are seeing those north, south, and east-west connections growing and making transportation access around the county and the Bay Area better for our community. In Hillsborough, I think tomorrow, additional lanes on I-275 southbound will be open. That's a major improvement for our community, and FDOT is planning a replacement of the Howard Franklin Bridge, which is a major connector between Pinellas County and Hillsborough, including the State Road 60 Memorial Interchange, which is a major bottleneck. So we are making progress in building roads, but as been said, our transportation approach has to be multimodal. It can't just be adding lanes, because we can never outbuild the congestion that growth brings to our community. We're doing well in terms of looking at new technologies, and I commend Senator Brandes for what he's doing in terms of mobile device-enabled ride sharing, which is important. We ought to have a statewide standard for that. In autonomous vehicles, we need to plan for that in the future, and pedestrian and bicycle safety is very important as we lead the nation in fatalities. But I want to focus on an element that I think we're behind on both sides of the Bay, and that is the public transit element, the bus systems. In Pinellas County, that bus system is PSTA. And our ridership is growing. It's been growing for the last 5 years. More folks than ever are riding PSTA. But the folks that ride it mainly because they have to. If you take out the folks that ride the trolley, which you might not know, most of the folks that ride the trolley make more than $50,000 a year. So we're talking about mainly tourists and high-income folks on the beaches and where the trolleys run in the downtowns. But for the other folks that ride on more than 40 fixed routes, Importantly, most of them work and they ride the bus to get to a full-time or part-time job, but most of them don't have a car or even a driver's license. So for them, it is about access to opportunity, access to get to that job, and we have to maintain that. The thing about PSTA in some degree hard is the way that we're funded. Not everyone in Pinellas County even pays a property tax for PSTA, and so we are financially constrained. Greenlight Pinellas was an initiative that would have solved that problem. It would have more than doubled the bus service and it would have added light rail. I believe that there will be a time for that rail discussion to happen again in our community, but I think that time is in the future, and I think personally that should focus on the core urban areas of downtown St. Pete and downtown Tampa where there's more support for that concept. But the PSTA board believes that right now, for the near future, we need to focus on that core bus system, how we fund it, how we make it more frequent, how we can add some late night and weekend hours for those folks that depend on that core service to get around our county. And I think the way we do that, is we will have to raise some new revenues through the property tax, we'll have to cut some routes, we'll have to modify some routes, and as I'm sitting here with the congressman, the senator, the secretary, I want to emphasize partnerships, that we will need partnerships for things like BRT, where FDOT is partnered with Broward and Miami-Dade for the Express 595. We want to do the same kind of thing here on BRT routes that are proven and that have the ridership to give us that premium bus service here in Pinellas County. So we believe there are significant challenges, but we also believe there are significant opportunities. The focus from the transit side needs to be on that core bus service and how we integrate that with projects like the Gateway Express, like the new Howard Franklin Bridge, and add on some premium bus service as we can pay for it.
Very good. Thank you, Commissioner. For those of you who have not already submitted questions and care to, the number is up on the board to text a question to, as well as an email, and obviously you can do it by hand. Let me ask a question that arises both when we talk about both transit, be it bus or rail, but also technology. In the future, what infrastructure improvements need to be invested in? In other words, what will our roads need to look like if we begin to adopt on one side technology or on the other side increase use of bus, mass transit, et cetera? Secretary Boxhold, you might want to take that from a 30,000 foot perspective, and then we can discuss it locally.
You know, we're sort of headed that way now. You know, there are certain areas of the state where we have dedicated lanes for bus rapid transit. You know, obviously in transit, you want a high quality, an enjoyable ride, but you also want a reliable one. And so to me, part of the reason that transit struggles sometimes is it's not a reliable trip. And so to the extent that we can set aside either lanes that are dedicated to bus rapid transit, or that we can allow the use of shoulders or other creative ways to get that reliable trip time, that will help. Down in South Florida, you know, we have express lanes that are variable rate tolled, which means that as the number of cars in the lanes increase, the toll increases. But as the Commissioner pointed out, we've invested significantly in bus rapid transit in those lanes. And what you will find is you get the benefit of the reliable trip time at an enjoyable experience. And so it has been wildly successful, and it is something that all sectors of the income levels take advantage of. Certainly if you go and look at the parking lots on a weekday morning, you'll see a variety of different manufactured cars over there. And then finally, I would say, you know, on the Howard Franklin Bridge, we're going to build that foundation so that it can support light rail. And so the Commissioner is right, at some point our corridors are constrained. We cannot build our way out, so we need to look for ways to move more people through the same space.
Senator Brandes, what does the future of public transportation look like in the Brandes technology world?
There you go. So I think the future wants point-to-point delivery systems. I think that's what people are going to come to demand and expect. Well, the biggest challenge you have in public transportation today is what we call the last mile problem. How do I get you from your house to the point of pickup for transportation, for transit, and then from your transit to your job? That last mile could take you longer than the trip on the transit sometimes. And it's unacceptable for you to really walk in Florida that last mile both ways. And so I just don't think people will use it that way. And so how do I solve that problem? And I think that's where technology is stepping in. And you're seeing this in a number of ways. First of all, you can see it with Uber, which started as Uber Black with their high-end service, moved down to Uber X, which is their car share service. And now below that, the price point below that is what they call Uber Pool. And Uber Pool is essentially a car pool service. So there's somebody always in the vehicle. And so what would have cost you maybe $20 in an Uber X costs you $10 or $20 in Uber Black costs you $10 in an Uber X will hopefully cost you $2 or $3 in an Uber Pool. And $2 or $3, it comes competitive, very, very competitive on a point-to-point basis with transit systems. And so I think that's really, really exciting to watch that start to unfold. If you look at what Ford Motor Company is doing right now, Ford Motor Company has their transit van. And they've shut off whole other lines in order to focus on this transit van. And they're actually developing an app technology to go along with it because they see that as, in many areas where it's not profitable to run a full bus, they could run a transit van and be fairly profitable. So I think you're seeing all of these different technologies, but I think the key is to focus on how do I get you point to point? How do I get you from your house to your job? And how do I do it in that $2, $3, $4 price point?
Real quickly, what is the status of Uber activity in Pinellas County?
So Uber is in 80% of the state of Florida right now. And in Pinellas County, we don't have a regulated taxi system, unlike Hillsborough County where they do. And so I think they're about to, what I'm hearing internally is that the city of St. Petersburg and Uber are about to enter into an agreement, or there's going to be some ordinance passed which they'll mutually agree on. And I think that you'll see proliferation of both Uber X and then Uber Black as well. And then I hope that we'll begin to discussions on how we partner with our partners like PSTA and provide that Uber Pool concept in Florida. You're starting to see this concept grow in other states. I think that's something that Florida could be, or St. Petersburg and Pinellas County could be a leader on, is to have this Uber Pool concept because of our density. And I think that will be really exciting once we see that take place.
Commissioner, with the continued growth of bus rapid transit, how is the last mile achieved?
I agree with Senator Brandis. PSTA is fully embracing the concept of ride sharing and integrating that into our service delivery system. For PSTA, it's really about partnerships. And even if Greenlight had gone forward, we still would have been open to that because the last mile is a reality. We provided something called flex routes in North County that use smaller vehicles, and they would veer off of the established route, I believe, a half mile to pick someone up because of the land use pattern up in North County. So that is a void that needs to be filled, and we think Uber and Lyft and other ride-sharing programs certainly could fill that. But where you have the density, like you have in downtown St. Pete, and you have destinations where folks want to go from there to the beaches, or maybe vice versa, get to a Rays game, and we believe the Rays will still be in Pinellas County, Congressman. You've got the density there already, so it's a matter of getting them service that can get you from St. Pete to St. Pete Beach in half an hour versus an hour and a half if you take the regular routes. And that's where BRT, I think, makes sense in our county. Proven routes where you can get some expedited service for folks that want to take that route to get somewhere efficiently.
Dr. Polson, you mentioned that transportation consumes, on average, 17% of household income.
That's correct.
Given the conversation about emerging changes, either through technology or bus rapid transit, how do we drive the cost out of transportation? How do we get that below where it currently sits at 17%?
Interestingly, it's actually been ticking down very slowly over time. And the technologies potentially enable something that could be quite transformative as it relates to transportation. In other words, right now people own a vehicle quite typically, and that's a very significant sunk cost and frankly close to the majority of their expending on transportation. So once they own that vehicle, the marginal cost to use it is relatively small, so they're highly incented to continue to use that personal vehicle. If the model transforms to the point where people don't any longer own their own vehicle, but have access to other vehicles through things like rideshare or app facilitated, what they call transportation network companies, bike share, etc. Then all of a sudden the ability to function without a personal vehicle, or perhaps with fewer personal vehicles in the household, it becomes a very real opportunity, and then you're much more likely to be in a kind of fully cost allocated decision mode where when you think about what you're going to do on a particular trip, an Uber cost doesn't look relatively high compared to the 12 or 15 cents out of pocket cost for driving your car. Costs that are 30, 40, 50 cents a mile or $3 or $4 a trip become very reasonable because you're not carrying that sunk cost of owning a vehicle. So those kinds of transformations could be very, very important, particularly for segments of the population that frankly struggle to own cars. Average car is $30,000 now. The average college graduate has $27,000 in debt. At graduation, it's challenging for young folks to own cars. So these opportunities can create some opportunities for them to have high quality mobility because there's a plethora of different services out there that they can take advantage of. And of course, the technology enables all of that. Electronic payment, electronic communications, securing rides, securing pools, etc. So all of those things can help. Now, having said all that, we admittedly underinvest in transportation. We could argue a lot about how much we're underinvesting, but so the idea that the total cost is going to go down may or may not be realistic. We are more urban-centric. The marginal cost of new capacity is very high. It's difficult to fit new capacity of whatever type into existing urban environments, and we've got a lot of infrastructure to maintain. So the total cost might go down, but we might have more options, might not go down, but we might have more options and choices for folks going forward.
So one of the themes is cost behind expanded service. Here's a question from the audience, and I'm going to expand upon it a little bit. The question is, do you think that a light rail transit system would be better achieved through a private contractor than through public tax dollars? And I would add to that, generally, if you want to discuss the economics of transportation and reasons for not having the public investment. But let's begin with the question, do you think that a light rail transit system would be better achieved through a private contractor than through public tax dollars? I'll open it up to whomever wants to take the first bite. Sure, you go first.
Sure, I'll take a shot at it. I mean, the reality is transit is subsidized all across the globe, all across the country, with a few exceptions in some very unique markets, requires some kind of subsidy. Now,
are there markets in the U.S. that are not subsidized?
There's small pieces of markets. They make a lot of money on the bus that runs down the strip in Vegas, for example. Yeah. And there's some routes in New York, and there's a few express routes in certain communities that are net positive, but it's literally a handful of services across the country that are net positive that could cover their capital costs, say nothing of their operating costs. So ultimately, the private sector would be delighted to be partners. They are in many communities. They can help control costs. They can, in some cases, bring some economy of scale and some management efficiencies, but ultimately they're going to need some type of subsidy or some type of resource to close that gap because as it currently exists in the competitive marketplace between personal vehicles versus public transit, we've not been able to price transit at a way, partly because it's that per trip cost structure, but we haven't been able to price it at a way where it would be economical for the private sector to build, operate, and own and cover that cost. That's just not realistic.
All right. Commissioner Welch, your perspective?
I think the doctor covered it well. I would add that the P3 option, public-private partnership, was always an option in the Greenlight plan. We showed a maximum cost without any private investment, but that is always an option. But I think more importantly, the route matters. folks have to see a value. What is in it for me to invest in that rail system? Obviously, folks in North County and parts of Hillsborough with their referendum didn't see that value proposition for them. So the route is the most important part of it. I believe the next time we look at rail, it has to be between the core urban areas where the connection makes the most sense. But remember, even if Greenlight had passed for the first decade, the connection, for example, from St. Pete to Tampa would have been BRT over the new Howard Franklin. So I'm in the, and I think the PSTA board is looking at what is doable. We are not interested in fighting a philosophical battle for the next 5 or 10 years while we continue to fall behind in the actual transportation options that our community has. Let's find areas of consensus where we agree, and I can tell you throughout the Greenlight campaign, I heard a lot of support for the bus system, a lot of support for folks saying, why don't you do BRT? It brings a lot of the same advantages. So why don't we find consensus on those things, build the partnerships, and get that into place as soon as we can.
Secretary Boxhold.
What I would say is that we have two major commuter rails in the state, Sunrail in Central Florida, and then Tri-Rail down in South Florida, and neither of them are self-sufficient. The department built and continues to operate Sunrail for the first 7 years, and at that point it'll be turned over to local governments, and they're charged with either identifying a revenue stream to support it, or their county gas tax will be used to support it. And in the case of Tri-Rail, the department subsidizes that to the tune of 30 or 50 million a year. And so I think the commissioner is right. BRT is a good interim step until we figure out if there's a way to optimize rail as the ultimate solution to it.
Got it. So, question, so much of the debate over transportation is defined by limited resources and how projects are paid for. Question from the audience, why are there so many roads currently under construction here in Florida, including 19 and 275, and where did all that money come from?
So the reason it's under construction is because Florida continues to grow, which is a great story. So we are on track for 100 million visitors. They all get here through transportation. Half of them come over the road and half of them come by airport. And so the way the state transportation fund is funded is by a combination of gas tax. We do receive some documentary stamp taxes, which is the real estate transactions. And then we receive motor vehicle registration fees and other things like that. So our trust fund is funded by a variety of things, and as growth occurs, that trust fund grows. Sort of makes sense. And then, we obviously respond to growth. We do our best to anticipate it. But, I think the commissioner was talking earlier about there's always a need to fund transportation. We will never get ahead of that curve. And so we will always be trying to keep up with congestion and minimize congestion.
So being devil's advocate for, I think what's behind this question a little bit, we do often hear in terms of trying to justify at times a tax increase. On the federal side in the next 2 months, we'll have this debate over whether or not to raise the federal gas tax. And the message is that our transportation infrastructure is failing. We're behind the curve. We need the additional resources. But if you look locally at the massive construction going on, it becomes hard to really absorb that advocacy argument that we actually need more revenue. Academically, can you walk us through, because this is going to be a debate, I think by the end of May, is going to be the debate over the federal fuel tax.
I think Florida is in an exceptional position in relation to other state DOTs. Most of the other counterparts that I have in other states are 70 or 80 or 90% reliant on federal gas tax. Here in Florida, we only receive 25% of our budget through the federal gas tax, and it's because the legislature has diversified the revenue streams going into it. So it is probably very difficult to live in Florida and understand the transportation crisis. Our infrastructure is consistently rated one of the best in the country. And I do think, to your point, the U.S. DOT Secretary came to Tallahassee and Jacksonville a few weeks ago to talk about the infrastructure crisis, and Florida's, or the nation's roads are crumbling. That very same day, the governor and I were in Orlando doing the groundbreaking for I-4. And so Florida is a little bit of an anomaly, and it's because we have worked to expand the revenue going into that trust fund. The The result of that is there are more state dollars, which means that there are fewer federal dollars. And so we're sort of breaking away from the other state DOTs. The other thing that I will tell you is, in fairness to my counterparts, in Florida, our freezing temperatures, even though it seems cold during the winter, it's not really winter here in Florida, so we don't have the freezing, the contracting, the thawing that goes on. We spend a lot less on maintenance. We're not pouring salt on our roads. We do spend a good amount on maintenance, but that maintenance cost that they have up in the Northeast, ours would pale in comparison.
Senator Brandes, you have a perspective on how we fund transportation?
I would just add to that. Essentially, the Department of Transportation is, what, 85% privatized? I mean, as far as our roads.
85.
So think about that. I mean, essentially, all the design, all the construction, most of the vast majority of the maintenance is all in private hands. It's all contractually bid. We set out the standards. We bid it all out, and it's all being run by private companies that are here in the state of Florida. And I just want you to think through this. The I-4 Ultimate is a managed lane. The Tampa Bay Ultimate, which will come in a few years, will be a managed lane. All the construction work that you see being done on Veterans is a managed lane. All the construction that you're going to see done on the 118th is a managed lane. So much of the construction that you've seen take place is because back in 2011, we made a decision that all new capacity roads could have some managed lane capacity to them, some tolling to them. And so what we've committed to is not tolling existing infrastructure, not tolling the roads that are not tolled today will not have tolls on them, but to toll new capacity. And that has allowed us, given the low interest rates, to really invest heavily in managed lanes that are going to dramatically change our state over the years. We were able to move the 118th project up 20 years. 20 years. That's amazing. And I think that's incredibly exciting. And I think if you think about what we've done with the Hillsborough County Expressway Authority, 2 years ago, they asked for permission to expand into other counties so that we don't have to start the Pinellas County Expressway Authority. We can utilize existing resources, existing leadership, existing analytics to identify areas in Pinellas County or surrounding counties that might have opportunities to invest in today. So I think there's a lot of that discussion. I think one of the challenging things that we're dealing with right now is the gas tax, and how do we deal with that? And hopefully Cutter will go into a little bit more of this, but I think as CAFE standards or fuel efficiency standards continue to grow, one of the challenges for the state is that means people are driving less, two, they're using less gas, and our transportation infrastructure and our transportation system is really built on gas tax. And so one of the reasons Congress is struggling so much is because they're having a declining revenue base in gas tax. The gas tax was never indexed for inflation. So although you're paying more for gas, that isn't federal gas tax that you're paying more for. Theirs is, I think, fixed at, 18 cents or something along those lines. So the challenge for the country is you have hybrid cars coming online. You have Teslas that pay essentially nothing to use the roads. And so as more and more cars go electric, how do you fund long-term a system that was never really thought out in a way that electric cars would be as viable as they are today, and as amazing as the hybrid technology is, how that would decrease the revenues for the states and the federal government.
So what are the options for funding in that environment? You have a straight public tax versus user fee versus a hybrid. What is the future of transportation in terms of how we fund projects? You mentioned managed lanes. Perhaps maybe expand a little bit on exactly what a managed lane is and how that generates revenue, and then let's open it up to how we pay for projects.
So a managed lane is essentially a toll lane. It can be a fixed toll. It can be what we do in South Florida, which is a variable rate user fee, so we can guarantee you a 20-minute drive time, and and the way that we do that is that we will increase the toll, so that if you go on that road at at 2 o'clock in the morning, that toll might be 20 cents or 25 cents to use that road. And if you want to go on that during rush hour, it might be $7.85 to use that exact same road, but you're going to be guaranteed a travel commute time of 20 minutes. So that's one way that we're using technology to utilize road infrastructure. The other major discussion taking place right now is a mileage-based user fee. And that's the discussion really being led out of Oregon, which was actually the first state to implement a gas tax. It might be the first state to get rid of a gas tax as they discuss mileage-based user fees. But there is a whole host of other concerns that come along with mileage-based user fees that have to be addressed. One, everybody gets really uncomfortable when you say the government's going to put a chip inside your car and determine the mileage of the vehicle. Oh, by the way, they're not recording where you actually drove. Yeah, right. So how do we honestly deal with those concerns as well? So is it that we do kind of like a lease vehicle where you would pay an upfront fee to drive 15,000 miles a year? How do we break it into small payments so that every time you go to the gas pump, your car is calculating that and transmitting that to the gas pump, so it's capturing that. These technologies are years away. This is a New Ideas Conference, so these are some of the new ideas that we're talking about and some of the challenging issues that come along with it. But a mileage-based system, however we do it, is fairly standard and fairly, it's hard to argue that that's not a fair way to do it. How you collect it, the technology behind it, and the privacy concerns addressed within that are really the issues that we're talking about right now.
I would just add, on the express lanes, what we found in South Florida, and it is a variable rate tolling, and what that means is the more cars that get in the lane, the higher the toll goes, is we didn't take away any untolled lanes. There are no free lanes in Florida. There are no free lanes anywhere. You pay for transportation in one form or another. But the same number of untolled lanes that were there before the express lanes are there today. But we added express lanes to move traffic. And what we found is that by taking that segment of the population that was willing to pay the premium to have a reliable trip time, they went into the express lanes, and the average speed in both the express lanes and in the untolled lanes doubled. And so all of the road users benefited because we were able to introduce market forces and identify those drivers that were willing to pay the premium. And so VMT or mileage-based user fee, I think is a good conversation in terms of how we deal with the structural problem in the gas tax. But there are some things that we can do immediately to introduce market forces to address congestion.
How does a current Tesla driver contribute to highway and road infrastructure?
When they register their motor vehicle, those fees go into it. And then if there are other, if they have real estate transactions, obviously Tesla's probably the exception that proves the rule.
Sure, but are there additional fees for driving a energy efficient or clean energy vehicle? They're not.
No.
Yeah. Other comments on how we fund infrastructure?
Speak to that just a minute. Almost every community or every level of government that's addressing that issue of funding transportation, they'll bring in outside folks and they'll look at all the options, and then they'll look at everything from income to gas tax to property tax, assessment districts, toll fees, payroll taxes, etc. And then they'll go down the list and check them for things like equity and capacity and sensitivity to inflation. And then they get to the bottom of the list and they find out nobody wants any of them. That's kind of the reality. People don't want to pay for it. They are. There is right now a fairly significant disconnect between kind of the professional industry's aspirations and statement of need and the public will. And that's certainly, we've seen that at the federal level in particular, where we've had 32 extensions of transportation legislation with no solution in terms of long-range sustainable funding pattern. I personally like the idea of user fee-based systems, and I'm certainly comfortable for the near term with a gas tax type system. And when you think about it in terms of influencing behavior, if you're paying a cost and you see it, it's very transparent to you, kind of like like getting in a cab where you see that meter ticking, then you're sensitive and you think about the options, and is that trip that important, and should you be, buying a car that uses less gas, or shopping closer to home, or maybe living closer to work. And so it starts to influence your behavior and the amount you travel, the more transparent it is. And I like that from an economic perspective. However, the reality is that the more transparent it is, the more the public dislikes it. So we've got a disconnect there between the political reality and the kind of the behavioral appropriate solution. There are a menu of things. The tolling and the congestion type charges make loads of sense for high functional class, i.e. freeway type systems, but a lot of communities are struggling to find ways to deal with their arterial collector and local street networks, and we don't have good options for those other than user fees or general revenues. I particularly get uncomfortable with taking general revenues to fund transportation. I personally think it's important to make users pay for it, because I think that feeds back into their behaviors and their decisions on travel and land use and location, etc.
Well, so let me follow up with this question, and perhaps Commissioner Welch, you could take this, the discussion of user fees. In terms of how we resource or pay for transportation, to what extent do we need to consider economically diverse communities like we have in Pinellas County? The use of general revenue or transportation revenue versus user fees. Does it impact different communities differently? Is there a reason to stay on the tax model as opposed to the user fee?
Well, I think it has to be a combination, but I think whatever model we come up with, you have to maintain and improve the public transit section of that model. The secretary gave me a tweetable quote, "There are no free lanes," and I love that, because this concept that roads don't pay for themselves, well, no transportation really pays for itself. And I think it will have to be a combination of what we heard from the other panelists. For example, in Pinellas County, we have something called a penny for Pinellas. It's an infrastructure sales tax. And the plurality of that money, it's been approved by the voters 3 times for 10 years each, has gone towards transportation. So when we talk about the Gateway Express, for example, the county is contributing $70 million to that project, and that comes from that sales tax revenue that basically everyone pays in Pinellas, including our visitors. So I think that is a very good way for us to pay for infrastructure. The problem is we can't maintain it, because our transportation trust fund, like the federal transportation trust fund, will be bankrupt in a few years because of the gas tax issue, because cars are more efficient, because of hybrid vehicles. So I think the last time the federal gas tax was raised was 1993, more than 20 years ago. Same thing in Pinellas County, but whenever you talk about raising a gas tax, folks get antsy. So the last thing is that the county recently issued a citizen survey for our strategic plan update. We just received an update last week. The #1 issue in terms of importance from the citizens was traffic congestion. And the biggest gap between us, what they expect and meeting their expectations, was that same area. So they understand the value of transportation, that we need to invest in it, but they don't think we're doing a good enough job in doing that when you look at our congestion points around the county. So getting back to your question, I think everyone should pay into it, but certainly, going back to my original statement, most of the folks that ride our fixed routes make less than $25,000, yet they work in a full or part-time job. So they need to contribute, but I think it needs to be proportional.
And you may have better numbers than I did, but I heard a statistic that the average person pays about $40 a month to support the transportation infrastructure, which is way less than I pay for my cell phone. And so in terms of the deal that we are all getting as users of the system, it is a pretty low cost, and certainly in relation to some of the other expenses that we have. The problem is there's no transparency in that, and I have no idea on any given day how much I'm paying to support that system.
Secretary Boxhold, can you walk us through the concept of Florida as a donor state when it comes to gas tax revenue and investment in the state?
So this has been an issue since I worked in Congress 20 years ago. Florida Florida, on average, gets back 92 cents, I believe, for every dollar in federal gas tax, which means that 8 cents of every gallon that's taxed in the state of Florida goes somewhere else. And the difficulty that we have always had is when I was working in Congress years ago, I think it was 85 cents. And so we were always looking to get to a floor of at least 90 cents. And it averages between 90 and 92, not a whole lot higher. It's a continual challenge for Florida. From my perspective as the DOT secretary, this is one of those things that we will continue to address and never solve. And Florida will probably always be a donor state. And so, I think the state's decision to invest more revenue, more of its own revenue into our trust fund and just continue to address that. But I'm not sure that you ever solve that problem.
So let me ask you this question for Senator Brandes and Secretary Boxhold. You've introduced us to kind of the robust investment Florida's currently making and how we're a leader among other states, thinking just parochially. Why then have the federal gas tax if we're losing 8 cents on every dollar to actually contribute to other states? Why not, the word is devolve that federal tax into a state-based tax where the investment stays in Florida if we are a donor state? And I realize it's a hard question because we're losing 8 cents on every dollar. The state of Montana might answer this question very differently, but why then continue with a federal tax as opposed to devolving it to just a state tax?
I'd be happy to see it go from the current system to a block grant to states, so that the state gets a block grant of money, that all states get a block grant of money to handle their transportation issues, and that if the feds keep any money, it's to deal with interstate issues. So if there's a bridge that crosses a body of water, for example, between two states, that it might have the responsibility of that bridge between those two states. But for the most part, I think we should move to a block grant system that's somewhat that's consistent, that's transparent, and if that is, letting the states keep more of the federal dollars, I would prefer that versus sending it to the feds, letting them take their rake, and then sending back us the remainder. I think that would be a better system for the states.
Mr. Secretary, is that feasible among your peers?
I don't know that it's feasible out west, where you have a very sparsely populated areas with a lot of transportation infrastructure. In terms of Florida, I will tell you that as a budgetary practice, we have federalized every single one of the DOT projects that we have, which means that we go through the federal review process on every project. And the reason that we've done that is so that we can put federal money on any project. And so if in 1 year we get a bumper crop of federal money, every single project in the state, and regardless of what stage it is in, we can put federal money in it. We've done a study, and what we found is that the state-only projects, if we pursued a state-only project, which is the same level of environmental review, it's just less back and forth with federal highway. It still goes through the core process, still goes through Fish and Wildlife, that we can deliver those projects 2 or 3 times faster than we can if we federalize them. And so I believe that speaks a little bit to your point about the attitude at DOT, that not only are there money issues, but there are other issues associated with it that are causing us to take longer to deliver these projects than we can. And so I'm not going to endorse devolution necessarily, but I think that there are a lot of issues that come along with those federal funds that, again, much like how we fund infrastructure, are not necessarily transparent in the process.
Sure. And let me follow up with just an explanation behind this most recent conversation, because the authorization legislation for funding our federal highways is expiring the end of May. And the question is how to continue funding it. There are advocates who suggest raising the gas tax as one means to do it. You can make the case that perhaps we should just authorize fewer projects, that the reason for the shortfall is not because of the revenue, but because of the number of projects that have been authorized. Or you could make the case, and it's in Florida a pretty easy case to make, for devolution. To say, if we in Florida are doing this the right way and have one of the leading transportation systems, it's a hard case to make for subsidizing other states. And if we were to devolve the federal tax and turn it into a state tax, keep the resources here. This is a conversation around the end of May that you can expect to hear this debate over what to do with the federal fuel tax. I introduced that because as we get to the end here in about 10 minutes, that will end up being our polling question. It will relate to how to fund future highway projects. Let's shift a little bit to light rail, and I know we touched on it briefly. Commissioner Welch, I'll go to you first on this, but let's also broaden it to a more macro question in other communities. What lessons learned from Greenlight's failure can be leveraged to gain funding support for public transportation?
Well, I talked about it a little bit earlier. I think it's the value proposition. And I'll just go back a minute. Greenlight referendum was on this ballot. I think there were 7 other ballots, referenda around the state, 7 or 9, and 7 out of those 9 lost, including Hernando County and Polk, which did not have a rail element in them. So I think it was a combination of the rail issue, the value proposition, but also I think a lot of folks don't feel like this recession is over, and they're personalizing in their families. And I think the main thing was the 8% tax. And so folks want us to find other ways to pay to improve transportation in our county and focus more on the bus system. I believe that a rail conversation will make more sense in the future, but I think we need to show that transit works in this region. A lot of folks are from somewhere else, and they say, well, how's rail going to work in a spread out county like Pinellas? And during the conversation, we say, you know, we have more density than places like Salt Lake City that's expanded their rail system twice, and other areas. So we've got to show that value proposition, but I think there are ways that I mentioned before, BRT, getting that core system up and running with better frequency and service to show that transit can work for folks that have a choice, whether to start their car or whether to take transit to their destination. We've got to prove that first and then come back and have a conversation about rail, which is very expensive. That was the other piece of it. Folks thought there was a better value out there in things like BRT. So I think that's kind of a nutshell of where the rail vote went that way.
Dr. Poulton, what's the status of bus rapid transit in communities locally but across the country? Where's the trend line in bus rapid transit?
Interestingly, because that relates a little bit to your previous question, because we now have an option that can provide many of the kinds of service quality that we can get with rail, but at a lower cost point and a lower capital cost risk by using things like bus rapid transit. And not just that, we can do things like run express bus in managed lanes that still give free flow high-speed service. And some of these options, bus rapid transit in particular, but bus in managed lanes as well, those simply weren't even viable options because of the technology when a lot of the places that built light rail systems started those systems. So it is a little bit different time in terms of the range of choices that we have available to us. BRT has been moved ahead in various degrees of sophistication and performance in virtually every metro area in the country. Many metro areas have multiple BRT systems. Our center's done loads of research in support of the Federal Transit Administration in developing performance measurement and impact assessment materials for BRT. Virtually everybody's excited and enjoying the benefits of BRT, so it's certainly a new choice in the toolkit that's been widely accepted. There's certainly a lot of people still aspiring that someday they may want rail, and that may in fact happen over time, but right now they're being very, very well received with generally very positive results.
Senator Brandes?
Since we're at a New Ideas conference, I figured I'd throw out a new idea, and maybe not this is new, but I think it's probably bold, at least as far as making it as a statement. I think that you're going to see private companies like Uber, Lyft, Ford, Google, that they'll poach the bottom of the market from the public transportation space, and that within 5-10 years, without subsidies, they're going to be able to provide you point-to-point delivery systems and solve the last mile problem. And so I think whatever we think we know about mass transit 5 years from now will be an incredibly different conversation. And I think it will be fascinating to watch all this unfold. But I would love to see if there's agreement or disagreement on that, especially from our friends from Qatar.
Well, and let me ask this question as part of that. What would need to change in the regulatory environment or at the county level if Uber began running mass transit or rapid bus lines picking up people there's got to be some type of change in the regulatory environment, I would think. Is that right?
I would say the role of government in that space is going to be a couple of things. One, making sure that there's a proper amount of insurance, making sure that there is handicap accessibility, and making sure that there's a proper background check for drivers. I think if we could solve those three things, you will have 80% of the issue resolved. And maybe the fourth thing, which I think we can do fairly easy via technology, is to provide some mechanism where we have incentives aligned. So today, let's say the city of St. Pete gets $100 for that taxi cab license. They're in that taxi cab deal one time. If we were to transition to a per pickup fee that was a direct pass-through to a customer, 25 cents a pickup, and it's geographically located, then the city of St. Pete's in every deal. And therefore, they have a strong incentive to encourage this technology to move faster and to encourage it to accelerate. And so I think as we see new incentives align and we resolve those three other pieces, I think you're going to see this technology flourish. And I think that's a free market environment to operate in with consumer protections built in.
Dr. Poulsen and then Commissioner Welch.
A couple different reactions. One is I very much agree with the Senator that right now in transportation, there's some risk in making major infrastructure long-term investments. It takes us 10 years to plan, 10 years to construct, and we need 50 years of utilization to amortize an investment, and the world's changing very, very fast. So we need to be careful of ensuring that what investments we make can adapt and be flexible as technologies and capacities and features change over time. So there is a risk of locking into a rigid fixed technology that is outdated in any number of ways, from propulsion system to efficiency to technology, etc. And I do think there's going to be a huge role for app-assisted mobility options going forward. However, one element of public transit, and I sometimes differentiate between public transit, which is in some ways the social service aspect of meeting mobility needs for folks who don't have options, from mass transit, where the concept is more one of you're moving larger groups of people in single vehicles to capture some economy of scale of space and resources. And there are some environments, key urban corridor areas, where you need a big vehicle, you need to move masses of people, or you can't have the intensiveness of activity and the agglomeration of economies of some business districts, et cetera, without that. So at some point you're going to need some large vehicle modes, mass type transit modes, however they're operated, however they're paid for, and certainly to use technology for assisting is important. These modes are still very, very, they're toddlers in terms of their employment or development. They haven't been through economic cycles. They haven't been fully vetted in the legal system and the regulatory environment. And so a lot remains to be seen in terms of how exactly they mature. However, the concept of technology-assisted electronic payment using GPS systems, et cetera, that's spreading rapidly in both person and freight transportation, and we could well see vehicles, moving people in the rush hour and packages in the midday and all kinds of different things in the future that leverage technology. We need to be careful about creating more total volume on crowded roads if you've got lots of deadhead miles in these systems. So the ability to cluster and group people into groups is still going to be important for these systems to actually not overwhelm our infrastructure.
Commissioner Welch, you had a perspective?
I would just add to that, I think technology advancement is inevitable, and we need to be flexible in embracing of that technology, and things like ride sharing. In Pinellas County, we embrace that. It needs to come here. It helps us solve a problem. You think when we took spring break, we had a map, we memorized a route, we knew where we were going. My daughter, much to my chagrin, went to spring break and drove from Tallahassee to Miami, had never been there before by herself, and she had her Google map that didn't even exist 10 or 15 years ago. So technology is going to change, it's inevitable. From the transit side, I'm interested in what autonomous vehicles mean for transit agencies. Can there be transit agencies that use autonomous vehicles to deal with that last mile problem? So I think it's going to work both ways, and we as a transit agency need to be embracing of that technology, and we see that as something to help us deliver services.
Got it. Very good. We are pushing up on our time limit. I'm going to give you a quick lightning round to advocate for how you might vote on this question, not from a political perspective. I'm going to make it what you think is most feasible. So the poll question is, how would you fund future federal highway projects? It's conversations we discussed today, from increasing the federal fuel tax to devolution, which would be bringing it back to the state, to increasing tolling or user fees, and then other methods, and I would suggest other methods might include simply none of the above, that we accept the current revenue stream as is. Senator Brandes, I'm going to, again, this is academic, not political. This is a policy conversation. What do you think is the most feasible way of continuing to fund federal highway projects?
So I don't think it's A. I think it's probably a combination of B, C, and D. I think you're going to see.
You're not up again for 4 years.
I know, you're right. But I think it's probably the most honest answer I can give you is to say I think you should do block grants to the states. I think you should utilize user-based fees when possible, and that probably for the short term will include increased tolling. In the longer term, I think it will be a dual VMT gas tax system for some time to come, and then I think it will be a location-based fee in the short term, in the longer term as well. So I'll consider that other methods.
We're going to jump around here. Let's go to Commissioner Welch next.
Well, you knew my answer would be the same as Senator Brandes, so you could have skipped me. And I would preface all this with saying, is there a need?
Which would be?
Is there a need? And I think the answer is yes. I was reading Motor Trend yesterday, and they had an article on the gas tax in Motor Trend. So folks are seeing that there is a need for infrastructure. Yes, for the federal gas tax, hasn't been raised in 20 years. The need is obviously there. Yes, for the de-evolution, as Congressman Young used to say all the time for US 19, it's our money. We need to get a fair share of that money back for projects in our community. Tolling is a choice issue that gives folks a choice. If they want to pay more to access faster transportation, there's a choice for them. And then the other methods, yes, including public-private partnerships should be a part of that. So given that there's a need to increase our funding for transportation, I'd say all of the above.
All right. Dr. Polson.
I'm an all of the above advocate as well, and I would add some property tax assessment. Transportation brings value to land, and in some cases that's a mechanism as well. The reality is people cobble together resources to make projects go, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
And to our state secretary of the Department of Transportation, who has to sit with 49 others, what are your thoughts on this?
I guess what I would say is the Secretary of DOT is I'm sort of non-discriminatory about where my trust fund.
You just like the revenue.
But I think, to me, if you think about transportation, and whether it's the federal trust fund or the state trust fund, and think about it the same way you think of your retirement fund, which is you don't put all of your eggs in one basket. You diversify your portfolio, you diversify your revenue, which is how the state hit on other sources other than the gas tax, which is why we look at tolling as a choice. And so I would just encourage, not relying on any one of those answers.
All right. I'm going to ask our panel to stay here for just the closing moments we have, but let's say a hearty thank you to our panel for being here. And our most unscientific polling is up. Keep voting as you wish. Listen, this has been, I believe, a great day. I want to tell you something, and I mean this. This is the first annual. This is going to become an event that Pinellas County is known for, where we bring in national thought leaders, state thought leaders, pair them with local leaders, showcase, highlight the intellectual resources we have here. As I mentioned, I do want to say thank you to a number of folks. As I mentioned this morning, you may have heard me say I was kind of pushing to get this off the ground, and I knew it was a bit of a stretch, so the way I figured I'd do it was I'd tell a reporter we were doing it, and if it ended up in the newspaper, I knew our team would have to get behind it. I want to say thank you to my staff team, the team in our congressional office, J.D. White, Preston, Rudy, Jen, Nicole, everybody else that is here today that has been working very hard to pull this off. Thank you to the team in our congressional office. Please give them a round of applause. And then, of course, to the folks at St. Pete College and the Institute here, they have led this every step of the way. We had similar visions, and they just got together at the right time. Thank you to St. Petersburg College. And I will say we had other sponsors to help pull this off, and I want to acknowledge the Tampa Bay Times and Bright House Networks. And finally, Boston Holding Company, which is the owner of Big Storm Brew, Big Storm Beer. So if you see a Big Storm Beer out there, go buy Big Storm Beer. It helps us put this on this week. Folks, thank you very much. And I think for concluding remarks, I believe Dr. Law, is that right? Or Dr. Oliver. Dr. Oliver will bring us to a close here.
Thanks very much. It's been a long day, so I'll be brief. I am not Dr. Law. There is an irony in that Dr. Law, because of transportation issues, was unable to reach us here from the Clearwater campus, and so he asked me to close out the session and to thank all of you for being here. I'd like to add my thanks to the Congressman for the work of his staff, the work of all the staff from St. Petersburg College, who worked on all the logistics for this conference, for our sponsors. You know, this has been a dream. The Congressman mentioned it was a dream of his. It's been a dream of ours at the Institute from 5 years ago when we started forming the Institute and its mission, because civic engagement and discussion of issues in a nonpartisan way, big issues in a nonpartisan way, is at the core of what we do. This is the heart of our wheelhouse. And so to have this kind of conversation today and to hear from the Congressman that this is going to be the first annual is just it's just music to our ears. So thanks to all of you for being here, and I'd like to give one more round of applause and a special thanks to our guest host today, Congressman David Jolly. Thank you all, and have a great weekend.